All right, get this. You're in 1830s London,
Okay.
enjoying a cup of Ceylon tea.
All right.
You pick up the newspaper,
Yeah.
catching up on news from Calcutta.
Right.
Delivered, of course, by a steamship built in Glasgow.
Okay.
And here's the kicker.
Yeah.
That steamship was likely financed by investments secured by, wait for it,
Okay.
Indian cotton.
It sounds like a ridiculously complicated way to run the world, doesn't it?
It does, but that's the British Empire for you.
Yeah.
And that's exactly what we're diving into today.
Okay.
We're going beyond just dates and names. We're using John Darwin's book, The Empire Project,
Okay.
to understand how this web of influence, trade, and, power actually worked.
Darwin calls it the British world system. And it's a fascinating look at how interconnected the world already was back then.
Wait, so you're telling me my hypothetical morning tea was basically funding the British Army in India?
Well,
That's wild. Let's break down how this whole system worked.
Well, the first thing to remember is that the British Empire wasn't this uniform, centrally controlled thing.
Right.
It was a messy, constantly evolving collection of different relationships.
Not just a bunch of red splotches on a map, then.
Exactly. You had settlement colonies like Canada and Australia
Right.
by the 1890s.
Yeah.
They were itching for more autonomy and self-rule.
Which, spoiler alert,
Uh-huh.
they eventually get.
Right, but then you've got places like Hong Kong, strategically snatched up to dominate trade routes.
Right.
And then there's the big one.
India.
Yes.
Always a key player.
Absolutely. British India was unique.
Yeah.
It wasn't just supplying raw materials, it was actually financing its own administration and military through taxes.
Wow.
In a way, India was paying for its own control.
That's not something they emphasize in history class.
Right.
And speaking of things they gloss over,
Yeah.
this is where the Industrial Revolution comes in.
Absolutely.
This isn't your average empire reliant on brute force.
Right.
This thing runs on steam power.
And iron.
Right.
Darwin really emphasizes the sheer scale of Britain's industrial output.
Yeah.
We're talking about the mass production of iron, which allowed for mass migration, cheaper military might,
Right.
and cultural influence on a scale never seen before.
Wow.
This is what allowed Britain to project its power across the globe.
So are you saying that iron production is why we even have VE, things like mass transit and global shipping today?
It certainly played a huge part.
Wow.
But here's the thing.
Okay.
Even with all this industrial might, managing the actual empire was anything but straightforward.
Really?
Darwin describes the British government's approach as almost schizophrenic.
Schizophrenic.
Yeah.
Like they were trying to write a coherent policy paper with one hand tied behind their back,
Yeah.
while simultaneously trying to put out small fires erupting across the globe.
That's a great way to put it. They were torn between this ideal of free trade, which they loved to tout.
And the realities of powerful lobbies back home who wanted to protect their interests.
Exactly.
Like those opium traders Darwin mentions, pushing for greater access to the Chinese market. They weren't exactly the poster children for free trade, were they?
Not quite. And to make matters even more complicated as we move into the late 19th century, the game changes again.
This is where things get really interesting for you. Imagine being a fly on the wall in London at the turn of the century. Suddenly, everyone and their neighbor wants a piece of the empire pie. Darwin calls this era the octopus years, and for a good reason.
It's the perfect metaphor. Germany, Italy, Japan, the US, they all wanted in on the land grab. Imagine this massive octopus, Britain, stretching its tentacles across the globe, trying to hold on to everything while these new players try to pry things loose.
No more competition, more chaos. You'd think that would weaken the British Empire, right? But here's where Darwin throws us a curveball. This competition actually makes Britain stronger, at least for a little while. How does that even work?
Think of it this way. Europe at this time was a powder keg. All the major powers were terrified of upsetting the balance of power back home. One wrong move could spark a massive war. So they're hesitant to go all out over colonies. They're too busy watching each other, making sure no one gets too powerful.
So Britain's sitting there like the cool kid at the lunch table, knowing no one wants to risk a food fight over a slice of Africa.
Exactly. They're benefiting from everyone else's anxieties. But don't think for a second that they were comfortable. They might have looked powerful, but they were stretched thin, overextended, and starting to feel the pressure.
Like trying to manage a room full of toddlers hopped up on sugar.
Pretty much. And here's the real kicker. The empire wasn't just being challenged from outside. Remember those colonies itching for autonomy? Well, they were about to become a much bigger headache.
Oh no, those pesky colonists are at it again. What did they do this time?
It's quite ironic, actually. The British Empire had been exporting its own undoing this whole time. They brought their ideas of democracy and self-rule to the colonies, and guess what? The colonies started taking those ideas seriously. They began demanding a say in how things were run.
So basically, the empire created its own worst critics. Talk about irony. This is where things get really interesting.
It's like a child growing up and realizing they don't need their parents to make every decision for them. Take Canada, for example.
Right.
In the early 1900s, Prime Minister Borden, and it's worth remembering his name because he plays a key role here, starts pushing for Canada to have more control over its own foreign policy.
Canada demanding independence. That's like maple syrup refusing to go with pancakes. It's just
Yeah.
not natural.
Well, it was happening. And then there's South Africa, still grappling with their feelings after the Boer War. Imagine fighting for the very empire that just conquered you. Talk about a complicated relationship.
Talk about a messy family dynamic.
Yeah.
But we can't forget about the elephant in the room. Or should we say the tiger?
India, as always, remained the central, most complex issue. The British had created an educated class in India, a group of people who were increasingly demanding their rights and a voice in their own governance. But the thought of giving them real power, that terrified the British establishment.
So they tried to play it both ways, like with the Delhi Durbar in 1911. It was this huge GE spectacle the British put on, trying to project power while also dealing with India's leaders.
Exactly. Lots of pomp and ceremony, but not much actual power sharing going on. And sadly, this trend of clinging to power while pretending to loosen the reins would continue. As we move into the 20th century, those cracks in the empire's foundation, they become impossible to ignore.
You're talking about the World Wars, right?
Yes, the two world wars were like incredibly expensive and messy divorces for the British Empire.
You know it's bad when even war can't save a relationship.
It really is. These wars financially drained Britain. But even more importantly, they shifted global power to a new player, the United States. And if that wasn't enough, these wars gave the colonized people firsthand experience fighting for the very system that oppressed them. Talk about awkward.
And after all that, the British Empire limps along for a few more decades.
Well, it tried to. But then came the Suez Crisis in 1956. Darwin considers this the empire's last gasp.
This is where Prime Minister Eden tries to flex his muscles and show everyone who's still boss.
Right.
That's the one.
He throws a tantrum over the Suez Canal, clinging to that outdated idea of British dominance. But there was just one problem.
The world had moved on.
It's more of a slow fade out
Okay.
than a dramatic crash and burn.
Right.
The empire doesn't vanish overnight.
Yeah.
Instead, the final decades were all about managing this slow decline.
Really?
It's actually quite poignant when you think about it.
Yeah.
Here you have this global power, once the envy of the world,
Right.
desperately trying to hold on to fragments of its past glory.
Wow.
It's like trying to reassemble a broken vase.
Uh-huh.
You can glue some pieces back together, but it's never quite the same as
It's
it.
not even close.
Right.
And speaking of things that don't quite fit anymore,
Yeah.
the final withdrawal east of Suez in 1968
Yeah.
really signals the end of an era. The sun had finally set on the British Empire.
It's a powerful image, isn't it?
Yeah.
And it underscores this key takeaway from Darwin's book.
Okay.
The British Empire wasn't this inevitable force of nature. It wasn't destined to rule the world forever. There were choices, turning points, moments where things could have gone in a completely different direction.
So let's play a little what-if game.
Okay.
If we could hop in a time machine and go back to, say, 1900,
Right.
knowing what we know now, what do you think Britain could have done differently?
Ah, the million-dollar question. It's impossible to say for sure.
Right.
But there are a few intriguing possibilities. Imagine if they had granted more autonomy to those restless colonies sooner. Or what if they'd taken a less heavy-handed approach in India?
Maybe they could have avoided those messy divorces we talked about. Or maybe the empire would have dissolved anyway, just in a less dramatic fashion.
Yeah.
It really makes you think, doesn't it?
It does. And Darwin emphasizes another point that I think is so important.
Okay.
We've been focusing on this big picture view of the British Empire.
Yeah.
The decisions made in London, the political machinations, the wars and treaties.
Right.
But what about the individuals who lived through it all?
It's easy to forget that history is about people, isn't it? Not just faceless empires.
Exactly. Darwin reminds us that history is shaped by the choices and actions of countless individuals.
Right.
The missionaries, the merchants, the explorers, people who were driven by their own ambitions, ideals,
Yeah.
and sometimes just plain old curiosity. Their stories, their triumphs and failures add so much richness and depth to our understanding of this complex period.
It's like that saying, one man's terrorist is another man's freedom fighter. Everyone has their own perspective, their own motivations. And when you start digging into those individual stories, you realize that history is rarely black and white. It's full of shades of gray.
Precisely. And that's what makes it so endlessly fascinating, isn't it? There's always more to learn, more perspectives to consider, more pieces to add to the puzzle.
Absolutely. So there you have it, a deep dive into the heart of the British Empire, courtesy of John Darwin and the Empire Project. We've covered a lot of ground today, from the steam-powered factories of industrial Britain to the crowded streets of colonial India. We've seen how this complex system rose, ruled, and ultimately, how it fell. But most importantly, we've hopefully left you with a deeper appreciation for the messy, unpredictable, and often surprising nature of history itself.
And with a desire to keep exploring, questioning, and challenging the narratives we've been taught. After all, history isn't just about the past. It's about understanding the present and shaping the future.
Well said. And on that note, we'll leave you with this final thought.
Yeah.
If the British Empire could have a do-over,
Okay.
a chance to rewrite its story, what choices would they make differently? And how would those choices shape the world we live in today? That's something to ponder, isn't it?
It certainly is. Until next time, keep exploring.